So France in the 1930s, like a lot of other European countries, was faced by serious political challenges in response to the economic crisis brought about by the Great Depression. Obviously, you're aware. Well, let's start off with a quick Jeopardy question. We won't start on unless I press the button here. Okay, let's start with our quick Jeopardy question. This event in October 1922 led Mussolini taking power in Italy. Again, as history majors, you guys should know what is the March on Rome. So obviously fascism, the fascist party was established by Mussolini in Italy in 1919, and by 1922 had come to power partly due to its kind of physical intimidation of its political opponents. So Mussolini had been in power since the early 1920s in Italy. Hitler had obviously come to power in the early 1930s, 1933 in Germany, and there was a wave of fascist or quasi-fascist takeovers across Europe. And France was no exception in this regard, that there were a number of organizations in France that were committed to some form of fascism, French fascism. Let me give you an example of a few of them just to get a sense of the kind of the various groups that were involved. One was the Peasants' Defense League, organized by Henri Gorges. And initially it began as a kind of protest against falling agricultural prices due to the Great Depression. But Gorges clearly had intentions to potentially use it as a organization to propel himself to political power. Francois Coty was a famous French businessman. He actually made his money from selling perfume. And in the late 1920s, he established his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people. The name actually harkened back to a newspaper that Marat, one of the most outspoken supporters of the radical Republican regime during the French Revolution, he had a similar titled newspaper. And Coty essentially was trying to use media, the instrument of media, especially the instrument of his newspaper, to put himself forward as potentially a French equivalent of Mussolini, to become a kind of a French strong man. Another group that was established was the Croix de Feu, established initially as a veterans organization established by Francois de la Roque. And again, originally it was intended to be simply a French Veterans Association, but under de la Roque, it had quickly morphed into something that, in terms of hosting regular political rallies, in terms of its members kind of wearing uniforms, certainly in terms of the emblem, which you can see here on the screen, seemed to be kind of mimicking Mussolini's black shirts and Hitler's brown shirts as a French equivalent. And there were even more explicit examples. Perhaps the best example was Mouvement Franciste, the French movement, established by Maurice Boucard in the early 1930s. This movement, again, you can see from the picture here, was very, very openly modeling itself on Mussolini's black shirts and adopting the symbols of fascism as well. It looks like that guy there, second from the right, might be Hitler himself. But it actually was supported by Mussolini. It attracted 10,000 members, and it was just one of a variety of movements on the political right, of fascist movements that were aspiring to overthrow the Third Republic and establish a kind of strongman dictatorship in France. And in fact, one of the issues perhaps was the fact that there were so many of them, that there were so many different movements, that they didn't all coalesce around a single group. However, there was a moment in 1934 when it seemed for a moment that the fascist French right was attempting to take over power in France, and it emerged from a political scandal involving this guy, Alexandre Stavisky, who was a French conman essentially. So Stavisky had managed to wheedle his way into gaining control of a small provincial bank in the town of Bayonne in the 1920s, and began publishing bonds and selling bonds fraudulently to make profit based on the bank's name in terms of selling these bonds. He was finally confronted in 1927. He was put on, or he at least was charged. But over the next few years, he managed to stave off any kind of legal consequences by constantly having his trial postponed and deferred, constantly being granted bail, and we'll circle back to this in a moment, but eventually people became suspicious or at least when the scandal came out, it started to look like perhaps people had been helping Stavisky kind of evade justice. But by 1933, by late 1933, it became obvious to Stavisky that he had, as he had run out of lives, as it were, and he was about to be put on trial and sent to prison, and he could no longer avoid it. So he decided to go on the run. And this gained national attention in France. It's Stavisky, a conman who was on the run. He was finally found in January 1934, found dying of a gunshot wound in his hotel room by French police. And the question became, so the official report was that Stavisky had committed suicide, but there was a very strong suspicion people had that this was a kind of very convenient suicide at a very convenient time, and some people believe that he had actually been murdered by the French police because of his political connections, and that this was a clear sign of corruption. One of the what actually kind of elevated the Stavisky death in the early 1934 to a major political crisis was the fact that I mentioned that Stavisky had managed for so long to avoid actually being put on trial, and part of the reason was, or at least one of the connections that people drew, was because of his lawyer. His lawyer was brother to a man called Camille Choutamps, and it just so happened that Choutamps was prime minister in 1934 when Stavisky was found dead, and so a lot of people would kind of assume that Stavisky had been able to use his political connections through Choutamps' brother, his lawyer, in order to avoid actually being coming to justice. So it created a major scandal in France, and Stavisky was forced to resign very shortly afterwards in January 1934. Shortly afterwards, a series of protest marches were announced for February 6, 1934. So in the wake of Choutamps' resignation, that is to say, there was a bunch of people who were going to march on the Palais Bourbon, which was the seat, which essentially was the assembly building for the French Chamber of Deputies. And there was a variety of different groups, many of them fascist groups, many of them from the various fascist sections. But there was also a communist march set to take place on the same day, and there was also a large Veterans Association march taking place. So essentially there was, on February 6, 1934, there was going to be a kind of large, disorganized, kind of chaotic mob of a variety of political stripes gathering outside of the seat of Parliament. And some people worried or wondered if this was an attempt by the French right to execute a kind of French version of the March on Rome. Mussolini seized power with threat of violence in Italy in 1922. This might indeed be a French equivalent. And what resulted in February 6, 1934 was chaos. The police tried to prevent the various protesters from getting at the buildings. Riots broke out and the police opened fire and actually shot dead 15 people in the chaos. So these were totally chaotic scenes outside of the Palais Bourbon, and a lot of people were very critical of the police overreaction, in particular the fact that many of the people who were protesting were French war veterans. There was a sense that these people had fought for their country, had sacrificed an enormous amount fighting during the First World War, and therefore deserved better than to be fired upon by the police for executing their democratic right to simply gather outside parliamentary building. As a result, the newly installed Prime Minister, Edouard Daladier, who we will see again in our next lecture, who had only been Prime Minister for 10 or 11 days, was forced to resign because of the anger at the police reaction to the protesters that gathered outside of the Palais Bourbon. He was replaced by Gaston Doumerage, who became Prime Minister again for about a year. And under Doumerage, he promised to kind of introduce some reforms that settled somewhat the French political scene. And since there was basically a great sense of relief in France, so this is Robert Downey Jr., this is what relief might look like, that potentially France had avoided a fascist coup, or at least an attempt at a fascist coup. Historians still debate whether that's really what was happening, because obviously the scenes were kind of chaotic and there was obviously lots of groups involved. Was there really an attempt by the French right on February 6, 1934 to take control in France? Possibly not. All the historians can't be sure, and there's a certain amount of debate about how likely it was that this could have led to a fascist coup in France. So, but what it did lead to actually was a greater awareness on the political left of the need to unify to stave off the threat of fascism, and eventually led to something known as the Popular Front. The Popular Front basically was a term not used exclusively in France, but is associated properly with France, of various left-leaning groups in various countries around the world, uniting, putting aside their own kind of political differences to unite against what they saw as a threat of fascism or Nazism. And in France in particular, that meant a coalition between the Socialist Party, the SFIO, and the French Communist Party. So the third organisation label up here is the Confédération Générale du Travail, which was one of the largest French trade union organisations. In the days after the events of February 6, 1934, they organised an anti-fascist march, and representatives from both the Socialist Party and the Communist Party came out and took part. And there was kind of a grassroots movement on the part of so basically the leadership of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party did not particularly want to cooperate. The Communist Party had been trying to destroy the Socialist Party since 1927, acting under orders from Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. The Socialist Party, not surprisingly, resented these efforts by the Communists to portray them as traitors to the working class. But the grassroots movements amongst both the Socialists and the Communists essentially was propelling these movements, these leaderships to join together. Basically, ordinary socialists, ordinary communists realised it does not make sense for us to fight against one another when there's a growing threat of fascism in France. And so what we start to get is an actual alliance between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party starting in 1934. Now, of course, these two parties even combined would never be large enough to actually take power in France. They would need help of the Radical Republican Party, which we've talked about in the past as well. The Radical Republican Party tended to be, certainly compared to the Socialists or the Communists, much more conservative in terms of that they supported small business owners. They were defenders of private property, which is in particular something the Communist Party did not support. But the Radical Republican Party agreed to work with the Socialists and Communists to form a Popular Front, broad left coalition to stave off the threat of fascism. Of course, there was distrust amongst the three parties. In particular, there was distrust amongst the Communist Party. So the image I'm going for here is a sudden about face that the Communist Party had been very adamant for several years that it would not work with other political parties, and as I said, had denigrated the Socialist Party as a party that was betraying the working class. So how was this sudden change of mind brought about? Essentially, it was brought about because Joseph Stalin ordered it to happen. He himself was growing concerned with the rise of fascism in Europe by the mid-1930s. So in 1934, he gave orders to all the communist parties of Europe to collaborate with other left-wing groups to stave off communism, even going to the point of the Communist Party voting for French military bills, increasing military spending for the French army, which traditionally had been an anti-communist position. But in light of the need for a potential conflict with fascist forces, the order was given. The three parties in 1935 held a rally on Bastille Day to demonstrate again their alliance. Some of the banners they ran with were "Give the workers bread, give the young work, give the world peace." So again, a kind of broad left-wing appeal to the ordinary people of France to work together in order to stave off the threat of fascism. The Socialist Party was led by a guy called Leon Blum. Blum was Jewish, and for that reason was a hated figure for many in the political right. Obviously, we remember back to the days of Dreyfus, where Judaism was associated with anti-Frenchness and certainly was not something popular amongst the French right. As it became obvious in 1934, 1935, that when the next elections were going to be held, as they were due to be held in 1936, that a victory for the Popular Front was inevitable. The rhetoric on the right stepped up. One of the famous posters was "Better Hitler than Blum," that the worst thing that could happen to France supposedly was a Popular Front victory and the premiership of Leon Blum. Blum himself actually was beaten up, attacked by members of the French right in February 1936. He had to be hospitalized as a result of this attack, but it was unable to stop him. And in May 1936, the Popular Front had a major victory. You see here, the Socialist Party emerged with the single largest collection of any seats, and therefore was given the right to govern in France. And the legislature, so this is just a map of the votes of the Popular Front. You see large parts of France, over 60% of the voters vote for the Popular Front. So the Popular Front has finally taken power. The big question is, will it be able to solve the problems of depression and put France on a forward foot economically and politically once more?